afternoon. It's very fitting that this preacher falls on a Sunday before Memorial Day. We remember fallen heroes who died for our freedoms. The era we'll be teaching out of is of the Revolutionary War. So for any fellow history buffs, I hope you find this interesting too. Let's see, once I find it. Real quick, this wasn't really part of it, but I saw this verse the other morning and I wanted to read it beforehand. Exodus chapter 3, we'll start in verse 10. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 10. We all know this account. This is the Lord calling Moses to take his children out of Egypt. It says, "Come now therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses said unto God, Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee, that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain." I like that in verse 11. It says, Moses said unto God, Who am I? This wasn't about Moses. This lesson is not about the preacher I'm going to be giving you. It's about what God did with him. I hope we can remember this. In each of these preachers from the past, I'm not praising a man. I'm praising what God did with a man. Because we're all unqualified to do what God calls us to do till He qualifies us. So, the preacher from the past that I'm on now is a man by the name of Isaac Backus. He was born January 9th, 1724, to Samuel and Elizabeth Backus. We aren't sure if his birthplace was Yantic, Connecticut, or Norwich, Connecticut. Either way, he was a Yankee. Great guy. He was raised by his parents in Norwich on their estate that included an iron foundry that produced munitions during the Revolutionary War. I'm not going to go into the iron foundry. If you're curious, you can look into that yourself. As far as his parents go, little is known about his father, Samuel Backus, other than the fact that he did work at the iron foundry there, and that he made a profession of salvation in 1736. And Samuel Backus died in 1740 when Isaac was just 16, leaving him a very heavy load to carry for his family at a young age. Isaac Backus did write a lot about his mother. We can kind of assume probably because he knew her a lot better, since she lived a lot longer than his father. His mother's name was Elizabeth Backus. She was a devout Puritan member of what was called the Regular Church of Norwich. I found that name hilarious. A regular church. I've not been to one yet that was regular. And I'm a preacher's kid. I've been to a lot of churches. There aren't none of them regular. Wow. But she joined that church in 1720. Isaac Backus records that she often told her children about a new birth type experience she had in 1721. I'm pretty sure we all know what that is. But at the time, sadly, these churches didn't teach salvation the way that we hear it. And so people were unfamiliar with this in that circle. Isaac, he has a personal diary he kept, a journal. And there are several history books about him that I encourage you to read. There's actually an entire historical society devoted to the history of Isaac Backus because he plays a very important role not only in us as Baptists, but if you've noticed this flag we have in the corner, he played an incredibly influential role in our freedoms as Americans in one of our core elements of the Bill of Rights. Needless to say, within his works, he wrote a lot about his mother. He had a lot of respect for her, and he said that he accredits his mother with his godly raising. I know a lot of us here were raised in a godly home. We take that for granted, the blessing that we have in that. On October 15th, 1752, his mother was arrested and sent to debtor's prison. That's something we don't like to think about here in America because that was abolished pretty quickly, but before we were free of England, there were debtors' prisons, and you went to jail for unpaid debts. It was a very small sum. I'm not going to go into details. It was a very small sum she was arrested for, something that her church family or even her son could have easily paid for, but it was an unjust debt, and she was not going to have anyone pay it for her, so she sat in prison. And mind you, these prisons are not like the ones we have today. So she lived the last part of her life in a very dirty cell for what she believed to be a necessary freedom. Isaac Backus, in between that time in his life, we don't know a lot about him. He didn't write very much of his time in between his childhood till his adulthood, but this is when his journal really picks up, was his spiritual birth. Isaac Backus was saved shortly after a large revival preached by Dr. Wheelock. Dr. Wheelock was a very close associate and friend of George Whitefield and Gilbert Tennant, and oftentimes would preach in the same areas when their evangelical routes crossed. This specific revival he preached was on August 24th in 1741. Isaac Backus was 17 at the time. And these were very popular events. This is the Great Awakening. There would be masses of people gathering to hear these preachers. And there would be a lot of converts. They were considered very emotional events. And you can see why. If you've ever read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, and that one's not my personal favorite, which now the name is slipping me and I didn't write it down. That's not my favorite of his messages, but these are emotional events. You'd have a lot of people who would make an emotional decision or have an emotional feeling and think it to be salvation. This wasn't the case for Isaac. He was at this revival, and afterwards, Isaac Backus loved the outdoors. He wandered off in the field to be alone and to pray and to think about all the things he'd heard. While there praying, he said that he knew his relationship with the Lord had changed. And he knew that he wasn't the old dead creature he was before, but he didn't know what had happened. They didn't teach salvation in the churches that he was in. So he went back. This would be 2 days later. I lost my place. Find it. He went back 2 days later, and Dr. Wheelock preached one of his more famous sermons titled The Children of God, and it explained what the saved were and what Jesus had done to pay for them. It was only after this that Isaac Backus understood what had been done to him, that the Lord had saved him. After this, his life changed pretty drastically. On July 11th, 1742, Isaac joined the First Congregational Church of Norwich. This is going to be kind of more of the meat to this lesson. We're going to learn about what Congregationalists were. Originally, even before the 1700s, Congregationalist churches believed pretty much along the same lines as we do. But they strayed pretty far from that by Isaac's day. Now, this is quoted from a memoir of the life and times of the Reverend Isaac Backus. This isn't his writing, this is other historians speaking about him. It says, and this is said about the Congregationalist church of aforetime, said, they maintained that the right of choosing and settling their ministers, of exercising discipline and performing all judicial acts was in the church when properly organized, and they denied all external or foreign powers of presbyteries, synods, general councils, or assemblies. Thanks to Brother Steve, we've learned what all these are and how they work. So, in simple terms, they believed in an individual church that had church authority. But by the time Isaac Backus came around in the early 1740s, they had drifted far, far from that. Congregationalist churches were almost closer to what we would consider Catholicism, as far as how they dealt with church business and how the church itself was run. We also have to remember, at this time, in the 1740s, separation of church and state did not exist. This is very much the opposite. Church and state were very much intertwined. And on first hand, you think, oh, that's great. We have church involved in government. That'd be awesome. No. Not a good thing at all. Separation of church and state is very much needed in order to have freedom to worship. I did not say separation of faith and state, or separation of Scripture and state. The church body as itself needs to be completely separate from worldly things because it isn't worldly. The original Connecticut Constitution, it was common for each state to have their constitution at the time. We weren't an assembled country at this point. We're still out of England. It was based, it actually adopted from the Cambridge Platform. I'm not going to go into a great deal about this because I've read the Cambridge Platform. I did not understand it very well. I'm just going to be blunt. I will leave that for Brother Steve to expound upon. You're welcome. I expect this Wednesday, full detail, 5-point outline. But there were some unscriptural practices in this. It allowed things like idolatry, blasphemy, and heresy within the church to actually be punished and dealt with by civil government rather than the church. So problems in the church were going to the courthouse. They weren't dealing with them here. When there's problems here amongst the body needs to resolve them. Because we have a higher authority than the civil government. There's authority from God within the church that needs to be resolving these problems. And they were actually punishable by prison at the time. Another, I want to say interesting, another sad fact is that this put churches under the direct rule of other churches and government entities, which we know is not scripturally based whatsoever. In fact, in Massachusetts, only church members of approved churches could participate in civil government or even vote. So just think about that. I would love to see more Christians in office, don't get me wrong. But as part of our freedoms, we can't restrict who takes office based on their faith, because there's a lot of Christians who have a different belief than we do. And this was by government-approved churches. And that's dangerous. When your church has to be approved by government law, you are not free to worship. There was approved messages, only approved preachers. And if you guys remember from when I taught on Gilbert Tennant, he was one of the few preachers at the time that did not attend a college to preach. He was not an approved or legal preacher. And this was a serious problem because we've seen this in today's world. Whenever the government restricts and controls something and manages it, it doesn't work. To take even farther, under this platform, landowners could only build a plantation in Massachusetts if they planned to support an approved Orthodox preacher. And preachers had to attend an approved college. Can you imagine today if we weren't, and we still are currently protected by separation of church and state, but can you imagine today if we could only call preachers that were government approved? But Steve, you'd fail. Let me just tell you, they wouldn't let you in. I wouldn't be here. I mean, I probably shouldn't be anyway, but I wouldn't be here. Can you imagine only being allowed to be a member of an approved church? I'm not talking about Middle Ages. I'm talking, this is America, 1740s. Keep in mind that right now the Revolutionary War is just on the verge. This is all brewing at the same time. Our history books like to only teach the political side of our freedoms and the political side of the Revolutionary War. It was very much a spiritual side to this too. I love the freedoms that we got from that. But we need to remember, I'm trying not to give away the second part of this. There's a lot of freedoms we got after that we didn't get yet. This is hard trying to decide how much I want to go into or not. Just because I'd like to go farther. So another thing, probably boring you to death. Under these Congregationalist churches and this platform, you have what's called an ecclesiastical tax. This was specifically a tax for churches. And this was law enforced. If the churches did not pay this tax, they were no longer an approved church. Pastors didn't teach paying this tax, you were no longer an approved pastor. And remember, we have a new problem here. When the church and state aren't separated, when all the governors have to be members of these churches, you've got a serious problem because all the church business is made by all the government officials. But these churches didn't really mind it because the ecclesiastical tax, we paid a certain percentage of our tithes and offerings to the government, and they expected a certain amount back. Government did things to protect the church, upkeep of the church building. So it was very much intertwined. Everything that happened in church, everything that happened in the government was very much mixed together, and it didn't need to be that way. There was a few preachers who strongly opposed this platform, not only from the government side of it, but from the church side of it. And we should, if you guys remember, should know all of these names. Timothy Edwards, Jonathan Edwards, and Gilbert Tennant were all strong opposers of how the churches and the government were run in early America. In 1745, Isaac Backus, along with over 40 other members, left the First Congregationalist Church of Norwich because they were accepting members who made no profession of salvation or showed no evidence of salvation. If you look in Acts chapter 2, I missed my passages from the other. I didn't highlight them, so forgive me. Acts chapter 2, verse 47. I don't know why I'm in the Old Testament. See, I teach you stuff and I get excited because I enjoy this and I go over things. And then I say things that are in the next part and I give stuff away. So please forgive me. This is probably falling apart. Acts chapter 2 and verse 47. Finally found it. It says, praising God and having favor with all the people, and the Lord added to the church daily such as should be saved. So, unless I'm completely misunderstanding this verse, the Lord's only adding to the church saved individuals. And these churches are adding anyone who wants to join, saved or not. You know, 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10. It says, now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that ye be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. I've been a member of a couple of churches, and even churches made up of just saved people, I've never seen one that doesn't have divisions, people saying not the same things. That's among all saved people. Can you imagine what a church is like made up of mixed membership? As far as divisions go, speaking the same thing. You've got members that are spiritually alive and members that are spiritually dead. How could you have a functioning church body? And we wonder why the government was falling apart. So these individuals that left the Congregationalist Church of Norwich were known as separatists. Now, clarify real quick. We are not separatists. I'm not teaching about separatists. Originally, Isaac Backus was a separatist, but that will change later on. We'll get there. Probably not today, but we'll get there. His specific group was known as the New Light Separatists. I kind of like to pick on that name because in what they believed, they were believing the same light. I don't know why they call it New Light. If it was New Light, they'd be heretics, but I'm going to leave that alone. They separated from what the church considered the original church. That's dangerous. Again, that a certain group of churches run by the government considering themselves the original church. So we're going to see what happens when they left. It's interesting. After they left, the original church demanded that this new group of people that were calling themselves a church, we know that they weren't a church because they didn't leave and start with any church authority, but they were demanding that they pay tribute. It's like we learned about tribute in Sunday school or something. I didn't plan this. I didn't know what any of the lessons would be today. I didn't even plan us to fall on the Sunday before Memorial Day. But in a time of separation and new coming freedom in America and in American churches, they said no. They said, we are a separate church from you. You have no authority over us. We're not paying your tribute. But if you remember, the original churches were intertwined with the government at that time too. This was actually legally enforced, that they send their tithes and offerings to another church. Think about that for just a minute. Because if we lost that freedom here today, we could be there very quickly. What do you think we would do? What would our answer be if we were notified that, hey, 12% of your tithes and offerings that belong to the Lord, you've got to give them to one of our government-ordained mother churches. It's going to go to a very large Baptist church up the road as tribute. How do we respond? How do we handle that? Are we ready to respond and handle that? Because this wasn't that long ago. This was the 1740s. This was in our country. They said no, and almost all of the 40 were imprisoned. Over taxes. It's hard to imagine here in America that lack of freedom. But if we blink twice and don't watch the news, we're almost there. Look in Romans chapter 13. If these come out in the wrong order, forgive me. I wrote them down, but I don't think I wrote them in order. So we're going to see how this goes. Romans chapter 13 and verse 1 says, in verse 1 of Romans chapter 13, it says, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. That can be a hard pill to swallow. There's a lot of powers in the world that we are supposed to obey that don't seem like they could be ordained of God, but if we believe in God's sovereignty, we know that they're there for His will, though we don't understand it. In verse 2 it says, whosoever therefore resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. I don't believe in verse 2 it's speaking of will be spiritually damned for resisting earthly powers, because he's not speaking of those powers at the time. Verse 3, it says, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So we're not talking about an earthly power here. Verse 5, it said, wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe no man anything, but to love one another, for he that loveth one another hath fulfilled the law. I've heard this passage twisted a whole lot of wrong ways. From both sides of the spectrum, all the way to the government has no say, I'm a Christian, you're wrong, to all the way the other side of, since we're a Christian, we have to be pacifists and we have to just do everything the government says. Well, it's hard to draw a biblical conclusion when you just read a few verses of a book of the Bible. I'll say that much. You need to know the entire context of the book of the Bible. And I don't have time to give the entire context. I mean, I could. If I went by Steve's clock, man, I can be up here all day. But if you look, I'll behave. If you look at Matthew chapter 22.
You're not going to try to explain that one?
This is for you on Wednesday. I'm setting you up, brother.
I got it.
I'm using some other verses to back me. I can't take all of it. Matthew chapter 22, verse 17. Try not to go overboard. It says, "Tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not?" So first of all, let's just look at this. You've got people trying to trip up Jesus. Not a good thing. Okay, you can't trip him up. And they're asking this question not out of the right spirit. Because you can ask questions out of the biblical spirit, and you can ask them out of the wrong spirit. Ask me how I know. I've asked Brother Steve out of both. Verse 18, it says, "But Jesus perceived their wickedness, and said, Why tempt me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny, and he saith unto them, Whose is this image upon the superscription? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things which are God's. When they had heard these words, they marveled, and left him, and went their way." And then if you look in Acts chapter 5, verse 29. Acts chapter 5, verse 29. And we've taught on this passage several times here in the past few months, so I'm not going to take the time to read all of it. We know what happens. The apostles are arrested for preaching in public. It says, "Then Peter and the other apostles answered and said, We ought to obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised up Jesus, whom ye slew and hanged on a tree. Him hath God exalted with his right hand to be a prince and a savior, for to give repentance to Israel and forgiveness of sins." So we've just looked at two different passages in which the law is questioned. In one, it seems like Jesus is just saying to obey the law. In the other one, it seems like the apostles are right in not obeying the law. In the first one, the church itself and what we believe is not what was being questioned by the law. Was it right? Probably not. Caesar's taxes were pretty unjust in the ways that they were carried out, especially the way the tax collectors collected their money. We've all heard the story of Zacchaeus, so you've probably gone into depth on that before. But that law did not prevent God from being worshipped and from his people worshiping him the way he wants them to worship him. Whereas this law is being broken in order to worship him. And he cannot be properly worshipped without breaking this law. I hope you understand the difference I'm bringing. I'm kind of treading on a dangerous line we've seen in recent years where it's come up as a problem amongst a lot of churches, a lot within our fellowship, of when meeting, was it against the law, was it in the law, it's kind of a gray area. And I'm not even going to get on the whole reason of it. I'm going to leave that alone. That's for Brother Steve on Wednesday. I've set him all up. He's ready to go now. So, going back, trying to put this together the way I see it, and it's not coming out very well, I know that for sure. These separatists that were being taxed, this wasn't the tax money that was the problem. It was the submission of their church authority to another church that was not a true church. They weren't a true church either, don't get me wrong. But our church authority is through God and God only. The problem is when a government entity or another church, or literally anyone and anything but God, tries to hold specific authority in church worship, in church business, and in the message taught by the church. That's the problem. So don't get hung up in the fact that they just didn't want to pay taxes. There probably were some who didn't want to pay the couple of cents tax it was. But realize there were people going to jail for this over recognizing the authority that lies. And where the authority lies in the church, that should hit hard. Because things get bad and things get rough politically. That's not where my mind goes. I think about other things. I mean, the first thing in my mind is always food. Where am I going to get food? We like to worry about money. There's inflation and all this other stuff. We really like to complain about gas. When was the last time that we worried about our church freedom to worship the way we need to? Or even if I really hate the gray areas, so we'll use them as an example. You're allowed to worship any way you want. Just make sure you have your pastor's licensed. That's not an uncommon law in our world. It's not here yet. It could be. I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger on who was arrested and who wasn't arrested. On what ends up happening to Isaac Backus. And I'm sure if any of you took American history, you know what happens in the history side of all this. If not, you're going to be in for a rude awakening next week. I guess I'll announce it for you. I'll be doing this Sunday school. Next week will be part 2 of this lesson. So, that jumbled up mess was all I have for today. Brother Jason, would